Hey guys, so today we're going to do merge intervals. I guess it's a pretty liked question. So given a collection of intervals, merge all overlapping intervals. So what does this mean? First, we need to understand the language of this question. So what do we not know? Don't know what an interval is, don't know what an overlapping interval is, we don't know what it means to merge overlapping intervals. Okay, so let's look at the examples. The first example shows we have an array of arrays where each inner array is an interval. So we have an interval 1, 3, an interval 2, 6, an interval 8, 10, and an interval 15, 18. So what we want to do is, because intervals 1, 3, and 2, 6 overlap, we want to merge them into 1, 6 in our output array. And then because 8, 10 does not merge with 1, 6, we add 8, 10 to our output array. And because 15, 18 does not merge with 8, 10, we add 15, 18 to our output array. Example 2. So we have 1, 4 and 4, 5. Because these overlap in that the end value of the first interval is greater than or equal to the start value of the next interval, we have this output array that is 1, 5, output array that contains the interval 1, 5. Before you start coding, it's best to kind of consider the edge cases. So what if there always two values in the interval? Are they always in ascending order? Can we assume that we have an input that has intervals within it? Stuff like that. So once you understand the question, we have to find out the solution. So, my first intuition is, okay, take an interval, compare it with every other interval in this array, and see if you have any overlapping intervals. If you do, merge them and continue on with this process. If you don't, then you probably finish the process and you have your output list of merged intervals. Now, the problem with this approach, even though it probably works, is that it's super slow. For every interval you're touching, you're going to ask to see if you overlap with any of the other intervals in the array. Since there's no bounds at the bottom here that tell you how many intervals can be in the array, this can be very, very time consuming. So we should think about how we can modify the input array into another array that satisfies the constraint that once we consider an index I, we're not going to have to consider any index j that is less than I. So in not annoying indices, once we pass an interval, we don't have to consider intervals that came before it. An obvious approach there is sorting this input array. And I think that's generally a good idea to consider whenever you have a collection of items. Are they sorted? Okay, so let's just take a crack at coding this. I like to always check my inputs, so if not intervals, we want to return, in this case, maybe an empty array. Now we said we wanted to sort our intervals, so we can just overwrite the variable with sorted intervals. We want this sorted function to first sort by first element and then by second. In the case we have an interval that's like 1 through 4 and 1, 3, we want actually 1, 3 to come before 1, 4, right? Now we have our sorted intervals. Now let's initialize our output array. So merge intervals, let's call it, is an array. And let's return merged intervals down here. Now we said we would consider the next interval with our last merged interval. And right now we have no last merged intervals. So let's assume we can initialize our merged intervals array with the first interval of our input array. So merged intervals dot append our intervals of 0. Now that we have our last merged interval in our merged intervals array, we can kind of iterate through the rest of the intervals and compare our current interval with our last merged interval, see if they overlap, and go on from there. So for interval in intervals after the first one, we want to get our last merged interval, which is merged intervals -1 in Python, and say if our last merge interval overlaps with our current interval, then do something. So let's put a helper function there. So if self dot is overlapping interval, give it the last merged interval, the last merged interval with our current interval. If they are overlapping, do something, otherwise do something. So if they do overlap, we want to do a couple things. We want to remove the last merged interval from the merged intervals array because we're going to be putting in the new one. So let's do last merged interval equals merged interval dot pop, right? We want to get the new merged interval with the last merged interval and the current interval. So we can say merged interval, or even we call it new merged interval, let's call it, equals self dot merge overlapping intervals. Give it the last merged interval and our current interval. And then we want to append this new merged interval to our merged intervals output array. Dot append new merged interval. Cool. Now we will have to handle the case where the intervals do not overlap. And so what we want to do is basically append the current interval to our merged intervals and call it a day. Okay, so here I see just right off the bat, we're doing this merge intervals that append in both the if and the else, so we can kind of move that out. So let's move that out. Merged intervals dot append our new merged interval. In this case, we don't have a new merged interval in the else case when there's no overlapping intervals, so we can kind of just name our current interval to our new merged interval just for consistency's sake. And we'll actually remove this one. So yeah, if the logic makes sense on our solution, this should work, assuming we have our two helper functions. So let's write those now. Is overlapping interval, takes self, takes interval A, and interval B. So let's consider what it means to be overlapping. As we see in this first example, these two intervals overlap because the end value of the first interval is greater than or equal to the start value of our second interval. So let's just do exactly that. So A start, A end equals interval A. B start, B end equals interval B. And return true if A end is greater than or equal to B start. So this looks good to me. Now, we have another helper function, merge overlapping intervals. So let's copy and paste. Also give it interval A and interval B. Interval B. So yeah, let's just do the same pattern here. A start, A end equals interval A. I'm just going to copy this one here. And then say, okay, our new interval is going to be A start and the max of A end and B end. Okay, so yeah, I think this works. Let's just run it. Oh, what happened here? Error name interval is not defined. Okay, oh, that makes sense. Hey. So yeah, let's just walk through this. So we have, if there's no intervals, return the empty array. Sort the intervals, first by the first element and then the second element if the first elements are the same. Initialize our merge intervals with our first interval from the given input array. Now iterate through the next ones. If they overlap, pop the last one, create the new merge interval, and then append the new merge interval to our merge intervals. If they don't overlap, just append the current one you're on. Okay, nothing too complicated. Let's submit it. Boom, 23%. I'll take it. And yeah, that's the whole question. We did it. Thanks, guys. Till next time.